The drums stopped, and silence fell over the market square like a blade coming down. Illyra stood on the wooden platform with her wrists bound in front of her, the rope biting into her skin, and she did not look down. She had learned long ago that looking down only gave people more reason to laugh. The crowd pressed close on every side, farmers and merchants and children who should have been in their beds, all of them come to watch the yearly tribute auction, the way other towns came to watch a harvest fair. "Look at her eye," someone called out from near the front, a man with a gap in his teeth and mead on his breath. "Half blind and still standing there like she's worth something." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Illyra's left eye had been clouded silver white since she was 6 years old, the result of a fever that nearly killed her and left its mark instead of taking her life outright. The village had never let her forget it. Cursed, they called her. Marked. Some of the older women crossed themselves when she passed, as if her scarred eye might leap out and touch them too. She was 19 now, and she had spent 13 years learning to stand very still while people said things like that. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Doran who smelled of onions and old sweat, climbed onto the platform beside her and cleared his throat. "The Hollow family owes 11 years of unpaid tribute to the Lycan court," he announced, reading from a curling scroll. "As is custom, the debt is settled by offering of kin. Illyra Hollow, age 19, is presented in place of coin." Illyra's father had not even come to watch. He had signed the paper the night before, his hand shaking not from guilt, but from the wine he'd been drinking since sundown, and then he had gone to bed. Her mother had died 4 winters ago, and there had been no one left in the house to speak for her. "Who'll take her?" Doran shouted to the crowd, though everyone knew this was not that kind of auction. There was no coin changing hands here, no true bidding. The tribute was simply handed over to whichever Lycan envoy had traveled from the northern court to collect it that year, a formality dressed up as a marketplace to make the humiliation complete. A murmur ran through the crowd, and heads began to turn. At the edge of the square, where the cobblestones gave way to the dark tree line that marked the border of Lycan territory, a line of riders had appeared. They moved without sound, their horses black as wet stone, and the crowd parted for them the way water parts for a knife. At their head rode a man Illyra had never seen before, though she knew at once, from the way every villager's laughter died in their throats, exactly who he must be. He wore no crown. He needed none. His presence alone silenced the square more thoroughly than any announcement could have. He was tall even on horseback, his shoulders broad beneath a dark gray coat, his hair black and unbound, his eyes the pale amber gold of something that was not entirely human, even when it wore a human shape. This was Kale, king of the Lycan court, a man whose name alone had kept the northern roads empty of bandits for 100 years, because everyone knew what happened to those who crossed him. He was not supposed to come himself. Envoys collected tribute. Kings did not lower themselves to stand in a farmer's square and watch frightened girls get sold like grain. And yet here he was, and his amber eyes had already found her. Doran, sensing the shift in the air, straightened his back and tried to sound official. "Great King, the Hollow family presents their debt in the form of their daughter, in accordance with..." "Enough." Kale's voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire square the way thunder carries across an open field, felt in the chest, before it is heard in the ears. He dismounted in one smooth motion and walked toward the platform, and the crowd that moments ago had been laughing at Illyra now shrank back from him, as though his footsteps might burn the ground. Someone near the front, either brave or foolish or both, called out, "Careful, my lord, she's cursed." "That eye of hers." Kale's gaze did not leave Illyra's face as he answered, "I have seen curses. I have caused a few myself. That is not one of them." The crowd went utterly still. He climbed the 2 steps onto the platform, and up close, Illyra could see that his eyes were not simply gold, but held flecks of deeper amber, like sunlight caught in aged wine. He did not look at her the way the villagers did, scanning for the flaw, the crack, the thing to mock. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing its name. "What is your name?" he asked her directly, which no one had bothered to do all morning. "Illyra," she said, and was faintly surprised her voice did not shake. "Illyra," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. Then he turned to Doran. "The debt is paid. I will take her." Doran blinked. "My lord, there is no need for payment. The tribute is..." "I did not ask what was needed." Cale reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, heavy enough that it struck the wooden platform with a solid thud when he set it down. Gold coins spilled from its open mouth, more gold than the Hollow family's debt had ever amounted to, more gold than most of the villagers watching would see in a lifetime. 11 years of tribute, and 11 years of interest besides, so that no one in this square can claim she was taken for nothing. The crowd's murmurs turned from mockery to something closer to awe, though Alira noticed with a small, bitter twist in her chest that their awe was for the gold, not for her. It had always been that way. She was only ever worth what someone else decided to make her worth. Cale turned to her and, without asking permission, reached out and untied the rope binding her wrists. His fingers were warm, despite the cold morning air, and his movements were careful, unhurried, nothing like the rough handling she had braced herself for. "You're free of the rope," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Whether you consider yourself free of anything else is your choice to make, in time." She did not know what to say to that. No one had ever offered her a choice about anything. He helped her down from the platform, and as they crossed the square toward his waiting horse, she felt the eyes of the entire village on her back, felt the particular silence of people who had spent years deciding she was worth nothing and were now furiously recalculating. She kept her chin level and did not look back at the house where her father was likely still sleeping, still unaware that his daughter had just been claimed by the most feared man north of the river. At the horse, Cale paused before helping her onto the saddle. His eyes moved, briefly, deliberately, to the clouded silver of her left eye, and she waited for the flicker of disgust she had seen 1,000 times before, the small recoil people never quite managed to hide. It did not come. "May I ask you something?" he said instead. She nodded, wary. "How long have they mocked you for it?" The question caught her off guard, gentler than she expected from a man whose name made grown soldiers go quiet. "Since I was 6, she admitted. "It happened during a fever. My mother said the healers thought I would die. I only lost the eye instead." Cale's jaw tightened, the first true emotion she had seen cross his face, and for a moment, the amber in his eyes seemed to deepen, like embers catching a breath of wind. "They mocked you for surviving," he said, half to himself, and something in his tone told her this was not a new thought for him, that he had encountered this particular cruelty before, in some form, somewhere. He lifted her onto the horse with careful hands, then swung up behind her, and as they rode away from the square, away from the village that had spent 13 years teaching her she was broken, Alira allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to wonder if perhaps she was not. The road north grew narrower as they went, the farmland giving way to dense pine forest, the pine forest giving way to the dark, ancient trees that marked the true border of Lycan land. Alira had heard stories about this territory her whole life, stories meant to frighten children into obedience. They said the trees themselves listened. They said the Lycan court fed on the fear of travelers foolish enough to wander in after dark. None of it had prepared her for how quiet it actually was, how the birds still sang here, how the light still fell golden through the branches just as it did anywhere else. "You expected something different," Cale observed, his voice close behind her shoulder. "The stories say this place burns," she admitted. "The stories are told by people who have never come far enough to see otherwise." There was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired familiarity, the sound of a man who had corrected the same misunderstanding many times, and no longer expected it to matter. Fear travels faster than truth. It always has. They rode for the better part of the day, stopping only once beside a stream, so the horse could drink, and so Cale could offer her bread and dried meat from his saddlebag, food far better than anything she'd eaten in months. She ate carefully, watching him from the corner of her working eye, trying to reconcile the man beside her with the stories that had haunted her childhood. He did not tower over her with menace. He did not smile with hidden teeth. He simply sat on a flat stone by the water, watching the current, occasionally glancing her way to make sure she was eating enough. "Why did you come yourself?" she finally asked. "You could have sent anyone to collect the tribute." Cale was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "I have collected many tributes over many years, sent by envoys who report back only numbers. Coin, grain, livestock, sometimes people, though I have never liked that particular tradition. This year, something told me to come myself. I did not know why, until I saw you standing on that platform. What did you see? Someone the world had already decided was worth nothing, still standing straight. He looked at her then, fully, and there was no pity in his gaze, which she had braced for, only something quieter and harder to name. I know something about being underestimated because of a mark I did not choose. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in the set of his shoulders told her the answer would come in its own time, if it came at all. For now, it was enough that he had not lied to her, had not dressed up his reasons in flattery. She had spent her whole life being told what she was. It was strange, and not entirely unwelcome, to be looked at instead as someone still becoming something. By the time the sun began to set, throwing long orange light between the black trunks of the pines, the trees opened onto a valley Elira had never imagined existed. Stone towers rose from the hillside, ancient and weathered, softened at their edges by centuries of wind but still standing proud against the darkening sky. Lights flickered to life in dozens of windows as the last color drained from the horizon, and somewhere far off, a wolf's howl rose and fell, not menacing but almost musical, an evening greeting rather than a warning. "Welcome to Aldergate," Cale said quietly. "It is not what the stories say it is. But I imagine you will need time to believe that." Elira looked at the castle rising ahead of them, its windows glowing gold in the last light, and thought of the village behind her, of her father asleep and unbothered, of the crowd that had laughed at her clouded eye that very morning. She thought of the gold Cale had thrown down without hesitation, of the way he had asked her name before anyone else in her life had thought to. She did not know yet what kind of life waited for her behind those stone walls, but for the first time in 13 years, she rode toward something without her chin lowered, without her shoulders braced for the next insult. She rode toward it, looking straight ahead. The gates of Aldergate opened before them, without a word being spoken, as though the guards stationed there had been watching for their king's return since morning. Elira felt dozens of eyes on her as they passed beneath the stone archway, Lycan warriors in dark uniforms who studied her with open curiosity, none of them cruel exactly, but none of them warm either. She was a stranger here, and stranger still for being human, and strangest of all, for being the one their king had chosen to bring home himself. Cale dismounted first and then helped her down, his hands steady at her waist, and she noticed the way the courtyard went quiet around them, the way conversations paused and heads turned. A woman near the stables, older, with streaks of gray and dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, watched them with an expression Elira could not quite read, something between surprise and calculation. "That is Liana," Cale said, following her gaze. "She keeps this household running better than I ever could alone. She will show you to your rooms." Liana approached with brisk, efficient steps, offering Elira a short bow that seemed more habit than formality. "My lord," she said to Cale, then turned her sharp eyes on Elira, studying her face, her clouded eye, her simple travel-worn dress, with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up new arrivals. "This way, if you please." Elira glanced back once at Cale, uncertain, and he gave her the smallest of nods, as if to say she was safe to go. She followed Liana through the wide stone corridors of the castle, past tapestries depicting hunts and battles long past windows that looked out over the darkening valley, and could not shake the feeling that she had crossed into an entirely different world than the one she had woken up in that morning. "You'll find the rooms comfortable," Liana said, as they climbed a curving staircase. "The king had them prepared before he left for the tribute collection. That is not usual, if you're wondering. He does not prepare rooms for tributes, ever." Elira did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and Liana did not seem to expect a reply. They reached a heavy wooden door near the end of a quiet hallway, and Liana pushed it open to reveal a chamber far grander than anything Elira had ever slept in. A wide bed, with soft blankets, a hearth already crackling with fire, tall windows draped in deep blue cloth. "There are clean clothes in the chest by the window," Liana said. "Food will be brought shortly. Rest tonight. Tomorrow will bring enough questions on its own." She left before Elira could thank her, the door closing with a soft click, and for a long moment, Elira simply stood in the center of the room, taking in the warmth of the fire, the quality of the blankets, the utter strangeness of being treated with care by anyone at all. She crossed to the window and looked out over the valley, the last light gone now, stars beginning to prick through the deep blue sky. Somewhere below, she could hear the distant sound of the castle settling into evening, voices and footsteps and, faintly, laughter that was not aimed at her. She thought of her clouded eye, of the 13 years of whispers and crossed fingers, and children taught to stay away from the cursed girl. She thought of Cale's hand against the rope at her wrists, gentle where she had expected roughness, and his question, quiet and unexpected, "How long have they mocked you for it?" No one had ever asked her that before. They had simply assumed the mocking was deserved. She did not know what waited for her in the days ahead, in this castle full of golden-eyed strangers, and a king whose reputation did not match the man she had met on the road. But as she finally sat on the edge of the wide, soft bed, and allowed herself to breathe for what felt like the first time all day, she found that beneath the fear and the uncertainty, there was something else stirring too. Something she barely recognized, because it had been buried under mockery for so long. It felt, unmistakably, like hope. Outside her window, the wolf's howl rose again over the valley, and this time, Illyra did not flinch at the sound. She listened to it the way one listens to a song in an unfamiliar language, sensing meaning beneath the notes, even without understanding the words. And somewhere deep in that ancient, unfamiliar castle, she let herself imagine, just for a moment, that she had not been sold into a cage at all. She had been carried somewhere she might finally be seen. Morning came softly at Aldergate, nothing like the harsh clang of the village bell Illyra had woken to her entire life. Instead, pale light slipped through the blue curtains, and somewhere below her window, birds she did not recognize called to one another in the courtyard. For a moment, still half asleep, she forgot where she was, and then memory returned all at once, the auction, the gold, the ride through the dark trees, and she sat up quickly, half expecting the warm room around her to have been a dream. It was not. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, and a fresh tray of bread, cheese, and berries had been left near the door, along with a folded set of clothes far finer than anything she owned. She dressed slowly, running her fingers over the soft blue fabric, and tried to steady the nervous flutter in her chest, before venturing out into the hallway. She did not get far before she encountered trouble. 2 guards stood near the base of the staircase, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw, looked her over with open scorn as she passed. "So this is the one he brought back," the man said to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice. "A half-blind human girl. I have heard he pays high prices for strange things, but this might be his strangest yet." Illyra's steps faltered, old habit rising in her chest, the urge to shrink, to apologize for existing in a form someone found unworthy. She kept walking instead, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides, and did not look back to see if they were still watching. She found her way, more by luck than direction, into a wide inner garden tucked behind the castle's eastern wing, walled in on all sides by climbing ivy and old stone, with narrow paths winding between beds of late-blooming flowers. It was quiet there, blissfully so, and she sat on a low bench near a small fountain and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. "You found the one place in this castle where no one bothers me either," a familiar voice said. She turned to find Cale standing at the garden's entrance, dressed simply today, without the dark travel coat from the day before, and something in his posture seemed looser here, less like a king holding court, and more like a man who had simply wandered outside for air. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quickly. "You are not intruding." He crossed to the bench and sat at the opposite end, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I built this garden myself, many years ago, when I needed somewhere quiet enough to think. I am glad it has found a second use." They sat in silence for a while, the fountain murmuring softly beside them, and Illyra found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile the guard's cruel words with the man who had thrown down a fortune in gold without a second thought. "The guards downstairs," she said finally, unable to hold the words back. "They do not think much of me being here." Cale's expression darkened, just slightly, the amber in his eyes sharpening. "What did they say?" "It does not matter." "It matters to me." His voice was quiet, but firm, and there was something in it that made her believe him completely. "Tell me." She hesitated, then repeated the guard's words as evenly as she could manage. watching Cale's jaw tighten with each syllable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fountain's rippling water. "I will speak with him," he said finally. "That kind of talk will not continue in this house." "You do not need to defend me," Illyra said, though something warm stirred in her chest at the offer regardless. "I have heard worse my whole life. I am used to it." "Being used to cruelty does not make it acceptable," Cale said. "It only means you have survived more of it than you should have had to." She looked at him then, really looked, and found herself unable to look away. There was something in his face, some old grief sitting quietly behind the strength of his features, that told her he understood cruelty in ways she had not yet guessed at. "May I ask you something now?" she said. He inclined his head, granting permission. "Yesterday, you said you know something about being underestimated because of a mark you did not choose. What did you mean?" Cale's hand went, almost without thought, to a place along his own collarbone, hidden beneath his shirt, and Illyra understood at once that whatever lay there was not something he showed easily. "When I was young," he said slowly, "before I became king, my father's court believed a mark on my skin meant I would be weak, unfit to lead a pack that valued strength above all else. They mocked me for it, in ways not so different from what you described. It took me many years, and much loss, to prove them wrong, and even longer to stop believing them myself. What changed? I stopped needing their approval to know my own worth." He turned to look at her fully now, his amber eyes steady and warm in the morning light. "I hope in time, you might find the same freedom." Neither of them spoke for a while after that, the silence comfortable rather than heavy, filled only with the soft sound of the fountain and the distant call of birds beyond the garden wall. Illyra felt something settling in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange, careful kindness of the man beside her. Over the following days, a quiet rhythm began to form. Illyra learned the shape of the castle, its long corridors and hidden gardens, the kitchens where a good-natured cook named Rosalind slipped her extra bread without being asked, the library, where towering shelves held books in languages she did not recognize, alongside familiar ones from her own village tongue. She learned, too, the shape of Cale's days, the hours he spent hearing petitions from his people, settling disputes between families, reviewing reports from the borders of his territory with a seriousness that left little room for the cruelty the old stories had promised. He sought her out often, not with any obvious pattern, but enough that she began to notice the rhythm of it, a visit to the garden in the late afternoon, a shared meal, when his duties allowed, small moments woven between the larger business of ruling a kingdom. He asked her opinion on matters she had never been asked about before, whether a particular harvest report seemed fair to the farmers involved, whether a proposed festival should honor an older tradition or make room for something new. She found, to her surprise, that her answers seemed to matter to him. "You do not need my opinion," she told him one evening, as they sat together over a simple meal in a smaller dining room she had come to prefer over the grand hall. "I know nothing of ruling a kingdom." "You know what it is to be judged unfairly," Cale said. "That is worth more than you might think, when deciding how fairly to judge others." It was a small thing, that evening, that changed everything. She had been laughing, actually laughing, at something Rosalind's young son had said earlier that day, a boy who had asked with wide-eyed curiosity whether her clouded eye could see ghosts, and Illyra had found herself explaining, gently, that no, it mostly just saw shadows and light. Cale had smiled at the retelling, a rare, unguarded expression, and for a moment, the weight he usually carried seemed to lift entirely from his shoulders. Later, as the evening grew late and the halls quieted around them, Illyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of the strange new life she had fallen into. She wandered back to the garden, drawn by its familiar quiet, and found Cale already there, sitting alone beneath the pale wash of moonlight, his expression more open than she had ever seen it, as though he had not expected anyone to find him in this unguarded state. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said softly, moving to leave. "Stay," he said, and something in his voice made her stop. "Please." She sat beside him, closer this time than the careful distance of their first meeting in this same garden, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The moon hung full and bright above the castle walls, silvering the flowers around them, and Alira found herself unusually aware of the space between her shoulder and his. "May I ask you something?" Cale said finally, echoing her own words from days before. She nodded. His hand rose, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished, and came to rest gently against the side of her face, his thumb resting just below the clouded silver of her blind eye. She flinched, an old and automatic reaction, bracing for the recoil she had learned to expect from every hand that had ever come near that part of her. It did not come. His touch remained gentle, steady, unhurried, tracing the faint scarring at her temple with something that felt, unmistakably, like reverence rather than pity. "I have seen many things called cursed that were only ever brave," he said quietly. "I do not see a curse when I look at you, Alira. I see someone who survived what should have broken her, and grew stronger instead." Her breath caught, 13 years of whispered cruelty rising up against this single, quiet moment of tenderness, and she found she had no words sufficient to answer him. Instead, she simply let herself lean, just slightly, into his touch, the first time in her memory that anyone had touched that part of her face without wanting to look away. Neither of them moved for a long while after that, the moon climbing higher above the garden walls, the fountain murmuring its quiet song beside them, and Alira understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever waited ahead in this strange new life, she no longer wished to face it as a stranger to the man beside her. She wished, instead, to know him fully, and to be known in return. Weeks passed, and Aldergate began, slowly and without Alira quite noticing the shift, to feel less like a strange country and more like a home. She learned the names of the household staff, learned which corridors caught the morning light best, learned the particular silence Cale carried when a difficult matter of state weighed on him, and the particular warmth in his eyes when he set that weight aside to be, simply, a man sitting beside her in the garden. Their conversations grew longer, less guarded. She told him about her mother, who had died 4 winters past, whose gentle hands had been the only ones in her childhood that never once flinched from her scarred eye. She told him about the years after, the isolation, the way even children her own age had been taught by their parents to keep their distance, as though her mark might spread like a sickness if she came too close. In turn, Cale told her of his own past, carefully, in pieces, the way a man tells a story he has never fully told anyone before. He spoke of the mark on his collarbone, a birthmark shaped strangely enough that the old pack elders had called it an omen of weakness, and of the years he had spent proving them wrong through sheer will, becoming stronger and more disciplined than any of the young wolves who had mocked him. He spoke, too, of losses along the way, allies who had turned to enemies, a betrayal from his own blood that had taught him to guard himself carefully against trust. "You do not seem guarded with me," Alira said one evening, as they walked together along the castle's outer wall. The valley spread gold and green beneath the setting sun. "No," Cale admitted. "I am not certain why. Only that from the moment I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to lower your eyes despite everyone around you wanting you to, I understood something about you I did not expect to understand so quickly." "What was that?" "That you had already survived the worst thing anyone could say about you, and come out the other side unbroken. There are warriors in my own court who cannot claim the same." She flushed at that, unused still to praise that felt so entirely earned rather than given out of pity, and found herself smiling more easily than she had in years. Not everyone in the castle shared Cale's warmth, however. Alira noticed it most in the presence of a nobleman named Varric, a tall, sharp-featured Lycan lord who held significant influence in Cale's court, and whose eyes, whenever they landed on her, carried a coldness that made her spine go rigid. She first encountered him properly during a formal dinner some weeks into her stay, an evening Cale had insisted she attend, despite her nerves, wanting the court to grow accustomed to her presence at his side. Varric sat several seats down the long table, watching her throughout the meal with an expression of polite, poisonous curiosity. "Tell me," he said at one point, his voice carrying easily across the table's quiet murmur, "how does a human girl find herself so comfortably seated at our king's table? I understood you were purchased as tribute, not invited as a guest." The table went quiet. Alira felt her cheeks heat, old shame rising fast and familiar, but before she could form a response, Cale's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerously even. "She sits where I ask her to sit, Varric. I would think carefully before questioning that choice further. Varric inclined his head in a shallow bow, but his eyes did not lose their sharp edge. Of course, my lord. I only wonder what the pack elders will say when word spreads that our king favors a human tribute above the daughters of his own kind. The pack elders will say what I permit them to say, Cale replied, and no more. The conversation moved on, but Alira noticed, throughout the rest of the meal, how often Varric's gaze returned to her, calculating, patient, the look of a man setting something into motion, rather than simply expressing an opinion. She mentioned it to Cale later, once they were alone in the quiet of the garden. He does not like me, she said. He does not like change, Cale corrected. Varric has spent years positioning himself as the natural choice, should I ever need an alliance through marriage, a match with one of the noble houses that would strengthen the court's old bloodlines. Your presence disrupts that plan considerably. Do you think he might do something? Cale was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. I think Varric is ambitious, and ambitious men do not give up their plans easily. I will keep watch. You need not carry that worry alone. But worry followed her regardless, a low hum beneath the growing warmth of her days, and over the following weeks she began to notice small things that unsettled her further. Servants who had once greeted her kindly grew suddenly cautious, whispering behind hands when they thought she could not see. A rumor began circulating through the lower halls, one she overheard by accident while passing the kitchens, that the human girl had bewitched their king somehow, clouding his judgment the way her own eye was clouded, turning him soft and foolish at a time when the court needed strength. She did not believe herself capable of bewitching anyone, but she understood, with growing unease, how easily fear could be turned into a weapon, especially against someone already marked as different. One afternoon, she found herself alone in the library, searching for a book Cale had mentioned the night before, when she overheard voices in the corridor, just beyond the heavy wooden door, low and urgent. The elders grow restless, said a voice she recognized as belonging to one of Varric's frequent companions, a broad-shouldered lord named Garrick. If the king continues to favor her, some among the outer packs may question whether he is fit to lead at all. Strength through bloodline has always mattered to our kind. A human tribute sharing his table, perhaps sharing more besides, that is not strength. That is weakness, dressed up as mercy. Patience, came Varric's cool reply. The king is stubborn, but even stubborn men can be maneuvered, given the right pressure at the right moment. I have not waited this long to see my plans undone by a half-blind human girl. There are ways to remind the court where true loyalty must lie. Alira stood frozen behind the library door, her heart pounding, uncertain whether to reveal herself or remain hidden until the voices moved on. She chose the latter, waiting long minutes after their footsteps faded, before daring to breathe normally again. That evening, she told Cale everything she had overheard, watching his expression darken with each word, the easy warmth of recent weeks, replaced by the sharp, controlled anger of a king assessing a genuine threat. He speaks of pressure, Cale said quietly, once she had finished. That is not idle scheming. Varric intends to force a confrontation, one way or another. What will you do? What I should have done from the moment his tone turned toward you at that dinner. Cale's amber eyes had gone hard, the warmth she had grown accustomed to, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. The ruthless king the old stories had warned her about finally showing itself, though notably, still not aimed at her. I will not let ambition dressed as tradition put you in danger, Alira. Whatever Varric intends, he will find I am prepared for it. She wanted to feel comforted by his certainty, and in part, she did. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the moonlit ceiling of her chamber, she could not shake the growing sense that the quiet, golden weeks she had spent falling into an unexpected kind of belonging were about to be tested in ways she was not yet prepared to face. Somewhere beyond her window, a wolf's howl rose over the valley, longer and more restless than the peaceful evening calls she had grown used to, and for the first time since arriving at Aldergate, Alira found herself unable to read whether it carried warning or comfort. She suspected, as sleep finally pulled her under, that she would not have long to wait before finding out. The days that followed carried a tension Alira had not felt since her first hours in the village square, though this time the danger wore a far more polished face. Varric made no further open remarks against her, no cutting comments across a crowded table, And for a while, she allowed herself to hope his scheming had cooled, or that Cale's warning had been enough to still his ambitions. She was wrong, though the truth of it revealed itself slowly, in small, deliberate strokes, rather than one obvious blow. It began with whispers that grew bolder by the day, carried through the lower halls by servants who no longer bothered to lower their voices when she passed. The human girl has cursed the king's judgment, some said. She has clouded his sight the way her own eye is clouded, turned him weak when the court needs strength most. Others spoke of omens, of an old prophecy twisted just enough to fit the narrative Varric wished to build, one that claimed a marked outsider brought misfortune to any pack foolish enough to welcome her in. Illyra tried at first to ignore it, telling herself she had weathered worse cruelty in her own village, and could weather this too. But this was different in a way that frightened her more than simple mockery ever had. This was not children calling names in a marketplace. This was a calculated campaign, aimed not merely at wounding her, but at undermining Cale himself, using her presence as the crack through which doubt could spread through his entire court. "You are troubled," Cale observed one evening, finding her in the garden with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. "The whispers grow louder," she admitted. "I do not wish to be the reason your people question you." "They question many things," Cale said, settling beside her with a tired sigh that suggested the day's council meetings had not gone smoothly. "Varric has been busy stoking doubts among the elder houses, framing every decision I make as evidence of weakness rather than mercy. Your presence is simply the easiest target he has found. Perhaps it would be easier if I were not here at all." Cale turned to her sharply, his expression fierce enough that she nearly flinched. "Do not say that. Do not ever think that. I only mean, I know what you mean, and I reject it entirely." His voice softened, though the intensity in his eyes remained. "Illyra, I have ruled this court for many years, without needing anyone's approval for the choices I make. I did not become king by bending to pressure from ambitious lords who mistake cruelty for strength. I will not begin now, over something, someone, I have come to value as deeply as I have come to value you." The word hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable, and Illyra felt her breath catch at the weight of it. She had felt the shift in her own heart over the past weeks, the way her thoughts turned to him, more often than she cared to admit, the way his presence had become, without her quite realizing when, the thing she looked forward to most in each long day. Hearing him name something similar, even indirectly, sent a warmth through her chest that momentarily eclipsed the fear Varric's schemes had planted there. But the reprieve did not last. 3 days later, word reached the castle of a disturbance along the eastern border. A small settlement of Lycan families reporting signs of an approaching threat, unfamiliar tracks in the forest, livestock found injured under circumstances no one could quite explain. Cale, along with a contingent of his most trusted guards, rode out at once to investigate, leaving the castle, and Illyra in the temporary charge of the court elders. It was, Illyra would later understand, precisely the opportunity Varric had been waiting for. She was summoned that evening to the Great Hall, ostensibly for a routine meeting regarding household matters in Cale's absence, and found instead a gathering of elder lords, with Varric positioned at their center, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern rather than triumph. "Illyra," he said, using her name for perhaps the first time since her arrival, his tone dripping with false warmth. "We are grateful you could join us. There are matters concerning your presence here that require discussion, particularly given recent events at the border." "What do the border troubles have to do with me?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the growing unease tightening in her chest. "Perhaps nothing," Varric said smoothly. "Or perhaps everything. The old stories speak of misfortune following those marked as you are marked. Some among the elder houses wonder whether your arrival and these sudden disturbances are entirely unconnected." A murmur rose among the gathered lords, some nodding slowly, clearly primed for this suggestion long before Illyra had entered the room. She felt the old, familiar tightening in her throat, the instinct to shrink, to apologize for the shape of her own face, but she thought of Cale's fierce insistence in the garden days before, "Do not ever think that," and found, to her own surprise, that she could not simply let this pass unanswered. "I did not choose this eye," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I did not choose to be born, or to survive a fever that nearly killed me as a child. If misfortune follows anyone in this court, my lord, I would look first to those spreading fear, rather than facts, rather than to a girl who has done nothing, but try to find her place in a home she was given no choice in joining." Varric's expression flickered, briefly caught off guard by her steadiness, before smoothing back into practiced calm. "Bravely spoken, but bravery does not undo the timing of events, nor ease the concerns of those who have sworn loyalty to this pack for generations." Before the conversation could continue further, a commotion sounded from the courtyard beyond the hall's tall windows, shouting, the clatter of hooves, voices raised in alarm. Elira's heart lurched toward fear, before she could even identify its cause, and the gathered lords rose as one, moving toward the windows and doors. What followed happened quickly, though Elira would later replay each moment slowly in her memory, trying to understand how close disaster had truly come. A small band of armed strangers, wearing no colors she recognized, had breached the outer edge of the castle grounds, moving with the coordinated purpose of those who knew exactly what, or who, they were searching for. Guards moved swiftly to intercept them, but in the chaos, one of the intruders broke from the group and made straight for the great hall, straight, unmistakably, toward Elira herself. She had no time to run. The stranger was fast, faster than any human opponent she might have faced back in her village, and she braced herself, certain the moment had come, for whatever violence Varric's schemes, or something worse, had set into motion. She did not have to face it alone. Cale, it turned out, had not ridden as far as reported, some instinct or warning drawing him back toward the castle sooner than expected, and he arrived through the hall's side entrance at precisely the moment the intruder closed the distance to Elira, moving with a speed and ferocity that left no doubt as to why his name alone had once kept the northern roads safe from harm. The confrontation ended swiftly and decisively, the intruder subdued and restrained before anyone else in the hall had fully processed what was happening, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Cale turned to Elira, his amber eyes searching her face with an urgency that stripped away every careful composure he usually wore in front of his court. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice rough with something that sounded, unmistakably, like fear held barely in check. "No," she managed. "I am unharmed." His hand rose to her face without hesitation, without regard for the watching lords around them, tracing gently along her jaw, as though needing to confirm with his own touch what his eyes had already told him. The gesture, so tender amid the chaos, drew startled murmurs from the assembled court, but Cale did not seem to notice or care. "I should not have left," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I will not make that mistake again." Behind them, the subdued intruder was being questioned by Cale's guards, and it did not take long for the truth to surface, a truth that would, in the days ahead, unravel Varric's careful schemes entirely, and reveal just how far his ambition had been willing to reach. But in that first moment, amid the settling chaos of the great hall, Elira found she could think of nothing beyond the warmth of Cale's hand against her face, and the fierce, unmistakable relief in his eyes at finding her safe. Whatever came next, she understood now, she would not face it as an outsider standing alone. She would face it as someone who mattered, deeply, to a king who had already proven, in more ways than one, exactly how far he was willing to go to protect her. The captured intruder proved far more useful than Varric had likely anticipated. Under Cale's steady, unrelenting questioning, delivered in a quiet room, away from the gathered court, the man's composure cracked within the hour. He was no border raider acting on his own ambitions, as the earlier reports from the eastern settlements had suggested. He had been hired, paid handsomely in coin that traced back, through a careful chain of intermediaries, to Varric's own household. The plan, as it unraveled, had been designed with cruel precision. Stage a disturbance at the border, convincing enough to draw Cale away from the castle. Arrange a second, smaller strike at Aldergate itself, while the king was absent, timed to coincide with a court gathering, where Varric could publicly cast doubt on Elira's presence. If the strike succeeded in harming her, Varric could claim it as proof of the very misfortune he had been warning the elder houses about, evidence that her presence invited danger to the pack. If it failed, as it ultimately had, he could simply distance himself from the outcome and continue his quiet campaign of doubt through other means. What he had not accounted for was Cale's instinct, the same instinct that had drawn him back to the castle sooner than expected, nor the depth of feeling that had sent him crashing through the great hall's side entrance the moment he sensed something was wrong. Varric was summoned before the full council the following morning, and Alira, at Cale's quiet insistence, stood beside him as the evidence was laid bare before the assembled lords. She watched Varric's carefully maintained composure crumble piece by piece as the intruder's confession was read aloud, as the trail of coin was traced back to his own seal, as lord after lord who had once nodded along with his whispered doubts now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to be associated with a scheme that had so clearly crossed the line from ambition into genuine treachery. "You would have seen her harmed," Cale said, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. "To protect a claim to power you were never guaranteed. You would have endangered this entire court's stability, risked war with whatever faction you hired those strangers from, all to remove one woman you saw as an inconvenience to your ambitions." Varric, to his credit, did not attempt further denial once the evidence had been laid so completely before him. "I acted for the strength of this pack," he said instead, his voice tight, with the particular bitterness of a man who genuinely believed his own justification, even as it collapsed around him. "A human at the king's side weakens us in the eyes of every rival territory. I did what I believed necessary." "You did what served your own ambition," Cale corrected coldly, "and dressed it in the language of loyalty, because you knew the truth would never earn you the support you sought." He rose from his seat, and though he did not raise his voice, the authority in his bearing filled the entire hall. "Varric, you are stripped of your title and your lands within this territory, effective immediately. You will leave Aldergate before nightfall, and you will not return." The council chamber remained silent as Varric was escorted from the hall, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. The ambitious schemer finally undone by the very court he had tried to manipulate. When the heavy doors closed behind him, a long breath seemed to pass through the remaining lords, tension draining from shoulders that had carried it for weeks, without most of them fully realizing how heavy it had grown. Cale turned to address the remaining council, his voice steady and clear. "I understand that change unsettles this court. I understand that old traditions carry weight, and that many of you have concerns about what Alira's presence here might mean for the future of this pack. I will not pretend those concerns vanish, simply because Varric's methods were treacherous rather than honest. But hear me clearly. Whatever path this court takes going forward, it will not be shaped by fear, and it will not be shaped by cruelty towards someone who has done nothing to earn either." One of the older lords, a gray-haired man named Halden who had said little throughout the entire proceeding, rose slowly to his feet. "My lord, if I may, some of us held reservations, yes, not out of malice, but out of unfamiliarity, with a path our court has not walked before. Watching how swiftly you moved to protect her, and hearing the full truth of Varric's scheming, I find my own reservations considerably eased. Perhaps it is time this court judged people by their character rather than by old fears dressed as wisdom." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Alira, standing quietly beside Cale, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound since the moment she first arrived at Aldergate. It was not universal acceptance, not yet, and she understood there would still be whispers, still be doubts that lingered longer than Varric's disgrace alone could erase. But it was, unmistakably, a beginning. Later that evening, once the council had dispersed and the castle had settled back into its familiar quiet rhythms, Cale found her once more in the garden, the place that had become, over the past weeks, something like a shared refuge between them. "You were brave today," he said, settling beside her on their now familiar bench. "Standing before the council while your presence here was questioned so openly, many would have crumbled under that scrutiny. I learned to stand still under scrutiny a long time ago," she said, "though I admit, it felt different today, not like something I had to endure alone." "You are not alone," Cale said, turning to face her fully, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Alira, I have ruled this territory for many years, and in that time, I have guarded myself carefully, against trusting too deeply, loving too openly, having learned early the cost such openness can carry. But from the moment I saw you on that platform, refusing to lower your eyes despite a crowd determined to shame you, something in me recognized a kindred strength I had not encountered in a very long time." She felt her heart quicken, hardly daring to hope for the words she sensed were coming. "What the world called your flaw," he continued, his voice low and certain, "I have only ever seen as the mark of everything you survived, to become the woman sitting beside me now. I do not offer you comfort out of pity, Alira. I offer it because somewhere in these past weeks, without quite intending to, I have come to care for you more deeply than I have allowed myself to care for anyone in a very long time." The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded in a way neither of them had quite dared before, and Alira found that 13 years of carefully built defenses, walls raised against a world that had taught her love, came only with conditions, could not withstand the simple, steady truth in his eyes. "I have come to care for you too," she admitted softly. "More than I expected to, more than I think I was prepared for, when I stood on that platform certain my life was about to become something small and cruel. And has it?" Cale asked, a faint, hopeful smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time she could recall seeing so openly. "No," she said, and found she meant it completely. "It has become something far larger than I ever imagined it could be." He reached for her hand then, lacing his fingers through hers with a gentleness that had defined every touch between them since the moment he first untied the rope at her wrists in that village square, and together they sat beneath the darkening sky, the fountain murmuring quietly beside them, the weight of Varric's schemes and the court's lingering doubts finally beginning to feel, for the first time, like challenges they might face together, rather than burdens she carried alone. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, the evening howls rose gently over the valley, and this time, Alira understood without question that the sound carried nothing but welcome. In the weeks that followed Varric's disgrace, Aldergate settled into a rhythm, gentler than any Alira had known since arriving. The whispers in the lower halls did not vanish entirely. Old habits of suspicion rarely disappear overnight, but they grew quieter, less pointed, gradually replaced by something closer to curiosity than scorn. Servants who had once hurried past her with lowered eyes began offering small greetings in the mornings. Rosalind's young son took to seeking her out in the kitchens most afternoons, no longer asking about ghosts but instead about the village she had come from, what the fields looked like in autumn, whether humans truly could not smell approaching rain the way Lycans could. Alira found herself, more often than not, smiling at these small exchanges, a feeling still unfamiliar enough that she sometimes caught herself startled by her own contentment. Cale's affection, once spoken aloud in the garden that evening, did not diminish with the passing weeks. If anything, it grew steadier, woven more openly into the fabric of their days. He no longer hesitated to seek her out during council breaks, no longer kept careful distance during shared meals in front of watching lords. Where once he had guarded his warmth toward her as though it were a vulnerability others might exploit, he now let it show plainly, a hand resting at the small of her back as they walked the castle halls together, a private smile reserved only for her across a crowded room. Not everyone in the court had fully embraced the change, and Alira understood that some quiet doubts would take longer than a season to fade entirely. But Halden, the gray-haired lord who had spoken in her defense before the council, proved an unexpected ally in those early weeks, taking it upon himself to include her in conversations about the territory's affairs, patiently answering her questions about Lycan customs and history, treating her curiosity as an asset rather than an intrusion. "You ask better questions than most of the young lords raised in this court," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the castle's eastern gallery, lined with portraits of Cale's ancestors, stretching back generations. "They assume they already understand our traditions, simply because they were born into them. You question everything, which is precisely how understanding is built. I only wish to understand this place well enough, not to feel like a stranger in it forever," Alira admitted. Halden paused before one particular portrait, an older Lycan woman, with sharp, kind eyes very much like Cale's own. "This was Cale's mother," he said quietly. "She came from a smaller pack far to the west, considered by many in this court, at the time, an unsuitable match for the future king. She proved them wrong within a year, through patience and genuine care for this territory's people, rather than through grand gestures. I suspect, in time, you will do the same." The comparison settled warmly in Alira's chest, and she found herself returning to that portrait often in the weeks that followed, drawing quiet encouragement from a woman she had never known, but whose path, it seemed, had not been so different from her own. As autumn deepened over the valley, Kale grew increasingly occupied with matters of state, negotiations with neighboring territories, preparations for the coming season's harvest tribute, disputes among the outer settlements requiring his careful judgment. Elira found herself drawn more deeply into these affairs as well, not merely as a quiet presence at his side, but as someone whose perspective he genuinely sought. The families along the southern border feel forgotten by this court, she observed one evening, after reviewing a stack of petitions Kale had shared with her, a habit that had become common between them. Their concerns are smaller than the disputes among the noble houses, easier to overlook, but that does not make them less important to the people living with them. Kale studied her thoughtfully across the table. You see things my council often misses, precisely because you have lived a life closer to those smaller concerns than most of the lords advising me. I intend to send additional resources south before winter fully sets in. Your instincts on this matter, and many others, have proven sound more often than I expected. You did not expect a village girl to understand matters of governance, she teased gently. I did not expect anyone to see this territory as clearly as you have, in so short a time, he corrected, reaching across the table to take her hand. I find myself grateful, more than I can easily express, that fate placed you on that platform the day I chose to collect the tribute myself. It was during this same season that word began spreading, quietly at first, and then with growing certainty, of Kale's intentions toward her. The court had watched their bond deepen for months now, had witnessed the ease between them at shared meals, the private smiles exchanged across council chambers, and speculation naturally followed. Some among the older houses still harbored reservations, quiet concerns about tradition and bloodline that Halden's steady support could not entirely erase. But far more of the court, Elira found, had come to genuinely respect her, not despite her human blood or her clouded eye, but because of the quiet strength and fairness she had brought to a role no one had expected her to hold. One crisp evening, as the first frost silvered the garden's late-blooming flowers, Kale led her not to their familiar bench beside the fountain, but further into the garden's quiet depths, to a small clearing she had not fully explored before, sheltered by old, twisting trees whose branches had grown together overhead like a natural archway. I wanted to show you this place properly, he said, before I ask you something I have been considering for some time. Elira felt her heart quicken, uncertain but hopeful, watching as Kale turned to face her fully, his amber eyes carrying a rare vulnerability beneath their usual steadiness. Elira, he began, when I brought you to Aldergate, I told you that your freedom, beyond the rope at your wrists, would remain your choice to make in time. I have tried, in every way I know how, to honor that promise, to let whatever grew between us grow, because you chose it freely, not because circumstance demanded it of you. You have honored it, she said softly, every day since. Then I hope you will forgive me for what I am about to ask, because it asks something significant of you, and I want you to know, you remain free to answer however your heart truly guides you. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small item wrapped in dark cloth, his hands, she noticed, not entirely steady as he unwrapped it, to reveal a delicate silver ring, its band etched with markings she recognized from the older tapestries throughout the castle, symbols of the Lycan court's oldest traditions. I do not offer this lightly, nor do I offer it because tradition demands a queen at my side. I offer it because these past months with you have shown me a kind of belonging I did not believe I would find again, after years of guarding myself so carefully against it. Elira's breath caught, 13 years of feeling unwanted rising against this single, overwhelming moment of being chosen so completely, so deliberately, by a man who had seen past every mark the world had used to diminish her. Elira Hollow, Kale said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath it. Will you stay at Aldergate, not as tribute, not as guest, but as my equal, and in time, as my queen? The question hung in the crisp autumn air between them, and Elira found that every doubt, every old fear about her own worth, every whispered cruelty from 13 years of a life that had taught her to expect so little, fell away entirely beneath the simple, overwhelming truth of the moment. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion she made no effort to hide. Yes, I will stay. Not because you offer me a title, but because somewhere in these past months, I fell in love with the man beneath it. Kale's expression broke into a smile so genuine, so unguarded, that Alira felt certain few in his court had ever witnessed it before, and as he slid the silver ring gently onto her finger, his hand rose once more to cradle her face, the same tender gesture that had first cracked open 13 years of carefully built walls in this very garden months before. "Then let this court, and every court beyond it, know," he said softly, "that the woman they once called cursed will soon sit beside their king as the most treasured among us." Beneath the twisting branches of the garden's quiet clearing, with the first frost of autumn settling silver over the valley beyond, Alira allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe in a future she had never once dared to imagine for herself. News of the engagement spread through Aldergate swiftly, and from there, through the wider territories of the Lycan court, carried by messengers and traveling merchants, until even the distant human villages along the southern border began to whisper of it. Alira heard, through Rosalind, that word had reached her own former village as well, that the very people who had mocked her clouded eye and pushed her onto the auction platform now spoke of her with an entirely different tone, one dressed in the particular awe reserved for those whose fortunes had risen far beyond anything their old neighbors had imagined possible. She found she felt little satisfaction in that shift, less vindication than she might have expected. The girl who had once craved acceptance from that village had, in truth, grown into someone who no longer needed it, her sense of worth built now on steadier ground than the approval of people who had never truly seen her. The preparations for the ceremony that would formally announce her as queen consort took the better part of the following months, winter settling deep over the valley, as tailors and craftsmen throughout Aldergate worked to prepare a celebration befitting the court's traditions, while honoring, at Alira's quiet request, some small elements of the human customs she had grown up with as well. Kale had insisted on this blending, understanding better than most the importance of a person carrying their whole history forward, rather than abandoning it entirely for a new one. "You need not become someone else to belong here," he told her one evening, as she fretted over which traditions might feel appropriate to include. "This court will learn to make space for who you already are, exactly as you learned to make space for us." Halden, ever her steady ally, took to escorting her through the finer points of Lycan ceremony, patient with her questions, gently correcting missteps without ever making her feel foolish, for not already knowing what generations of noble daughters had been raised to understand instinctively. Rosalind's son, meanwhile, had appointed himself her personal reporter of castle gossip, delivering breathless updates on preparations, with an enthusiasm that never failed to make her laugh, even on days when nerves threatened to overwhelm her. Not every shadow from the past months had fully cleared, however. Word reached the castle in midwinter that Varric, stripped of his lands and title, had not simply faded quietly into obscurity as many had hoped. He had instead taken refuge among a smaller, more volatile faction along the western border, a group of Lycans who had long resented Kale's rule, and who found in Varric's bitterness a convenient rallying point for their own grievances. Reports suggested he had begun spreading the same old poison that had once nearly succeeded within Aldergate's own walls, framing Kale's coming marriage as further proof of weakness, an insult to old traditions that demanded response. Kale took the reports seriously, doubling patrols along the western border and sending careful diplomatic outreach to the factions Varric sought to influence, determined to address the threat through steady vigilance rather than panic. He did not hide these concerns from Alira, having long since abandoned the instinct to shelter her from difficult truths. "Are you afraid?" she asked him one night, as they reviewed border reports together in his private study, the fire crackling low against the winter chill outside. "I am cautious," Kale corrected. "Fear served me poorly in the past, made me guarded in ways that cost me connections I might otherwise have valued. I will not let it govern how I face this threat, or how I face our future together. Varric's bitterness is his own to carry. I will not allow it to diminish what we have built." His steadiness reassured her more than any promise of safety could have, and as winter began, slowly, to loosen its grip on the valley, the threat from the western factions remained watched but contained, never quite escalating into the crisis some had feared. Whatever Varric hoped to build from his exile, it seemed, could not compete with the genuine loyalty Kale had cultivated across his territory, through years of fair, steady rule, loyalty that Alira herself had come to represent rather than undermine, as the months of her presence at Aldergate had proven to even the most skeptical among the court. By the time early spring arrived, green pushing up through the last patches of melting snow across the valley, the day of the ceremony finally came, and Alira found herself standing once more before a gathered crowd, much as she had on that first, terrible morning in her home village. But everything about this moment stood in stark contrast to that earlier one. She wore no rope at her wrists now, but instead a gown of deep blue, embroidered along its hem with the same ancient symbols that marked the ring Cale had given her, a gift from Rosalind and the castle's seamstresses, who had worked through the winter with evident affection for the task. The crowd gathered in Aldergate's great courtyard did not jeer or mock, but watched instead with genuine warmth, lords and commoners alike, drawn together by an occasion that had, over the preceding months, come to feel like a celebration belonging to the entire territory, rather than simply to its king. Cale stood waiting at the courtyard's center, dressed in formal attire that could not entirely disguise the same nervous energy Alira felt in her own chest, and as she crossed the distance toward him, she caught sight of familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Halden standing proud near the front, Rosalind and her son beaming openly, even several of the guards who had once eyed her with open suspicion, now watching with something closer to respect. When she reached him, Cale took her hands in his, and turned to address the gathered court, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, much as it had carried across that distant village square nearly a year before. "Many of you remember the day I brought Alira to Aldergate," he began. "A woman the world outside these walls had spent her whole life telling was unworthy, marked, cursed by a scar she never chose. I saw something different that day, and every day since has only confirmed what I recognized then, a strength forged through survival, a fairness earned through her own experience of unfairness, and a heart generous enough to extend kindness to a court that did not always extend it back to her in return." He turned to face her fully now, his amber eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide from the watching crowd. "Let it be known, to this court, and to every territory beyond it, that the woman once dismissed for a mark she carried, through no fault of her own, now stands beside your king, not as tribute, not as exception, but as equal, and as the truest partner I have found in all my years of rule." He reached up then, echoing the gesture that had first cracked open her guarded heart in that quiet garden so many months before, and touched her face gently, his palm warm against her cheek, his thumb resting just below the clouded silver of the eye that had once brought her nothing but cruelty from those who could not see past it. "They mocked what they did not understand," he said softly, for her alone, though his voice carried far enough that those nearest them caught the words as well. "I have only ever seen what it means to survive being underestimated, and to become, despite it all, someone the world could not help but come to respect." The crowd erupted into celebration as their hands joined fully, cheers rising warm and unguarded across the courtyard, and Alira, standing at the center of it all, allowed herself finally, completely, to release the last of the old fear that had followed her since that fever-stricken childhood, since the whispered curses of a village that had never once looked past her clouded eye to see the person surviving behind it. She had come to Aldergate as a tribute, sold to settle a debt she had never chosen to owe. She left that courtyard, months later, as a queen, chosen fully and completely by a man who had seen past every mark the world had used against her, and who had, in the quiet moments no crowd ever witnessed, taught her at last what it felt like to be touched with gentleness rather than judgment. Beyond the courtyard walls, the valley stretched green and bright under the returning spring sun, and somewhere in the distant hills, a wolf's howl rose to greet the new season, no longer a sound Alira needed to brace herself against, but one she had come, at last, to recognize as home. The season that followed the ceremony brought with it a kind of peace Alira had never imagined possible, the quiet, ordinary comfort of days, no longer defined by fear of the next cruelty, but by the steady rhythm of a life she had chosen, and been chosen for in equal measure. She rose most mornings to find Cale already reviewing reports at the small table near their chamber window, and more often than not, he set the papers aside the moment he noticed her stirring, unwilling to let even routine business steal the first quiet minutes of the day from them. Her role within the court continued to grow in the months that followed, not merely as Cale's wife, but as someone the people of Aldergate had come to trust in her own right. She took particular interest in the concerns of the outer settlements, the families who had long felt overlooked by a court, more focused on the grand disputes of noble houses than the smaller, daily struggles of ordinary farmers and craftsmen. Under her guidance, new resources reached the southern border before the following winter, and a program she helped design brought healers to villages that had gone years without proper care. Word of Varric's fate reached the castle that same autumn, carried by a weary messenger from the Western Territories. The volatile faction he had aligned himself with, never as strong or unified as he had hoped, had ultimately turned on him when his promises of restored glory failed to materialize into anything beyond bitter words. He had fled further west, beyond any territory Kale's influence reached, and whatever became of him afterward remained, for Illyra, a matter of little concern. She had long since stopped carrying the weight of his cruelty, understanding at last that his schemes had said far more about his own fears than they had ever said about her worth. Halden, in the years that followed, became something like family to her, a steady presence who continued teaching her the deeper history of the territory she now called home, and who took particular pride, she noticed, in introducing her to visiting dignitaries as though she had been born into this court, rather than arrived at it through an auction platform's cruel bargain. Rosalind's son grew from an eager young boy into a promising apprentice within the castle's growing healing houses, still fond of reminding Illyra, whenever the opportunity arose, that he had been the very first in Aldergate to treat her with genuine kindness. On quiet evenings, when the business of governing a territory allowed for stillness, Illyra and Kale often found themselves back in the garden clearing beneath the twisting branches where he had first asked her to stay, the place that had become, over the years, something like a private shrine, to the moment everything between them had shifted from cautious hope into certain devotion. "Do you ever think of that morning?" Kale asked her once, as they sat together beneath a sky heavy with early stars, "when they mocked you on that platform, and I nearly rode past without stopping." "You did not ride past," she reminded him gently. "No," he agreed, "but I think of how close I came to missing you entirely. Had something not made me pause. I have never quite understood what instinct stopped me that day, only that I have been endlessly grateful for it ever since." Illyra leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the clouded silver of her once-mocked eye, catching the last light of the setting sun, without a trace of the shame it had once carried. "Perhaps it does not matter what stopped you," she said softly. "Only that you did, and that everything since has proven it was worth stopping for." Kale pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arms drawing her close against the evening chill, and together they watched the stars gather fully over the valley that had become, in every way that mattered, entirely and completely her home. The girl once auctioned off for a debt she never owed, mocked for a scar she never chose, had become, in the years that followed, not merely a queen respected across the northern territories, but a woman who had finally, fully, learned what it meant to be seen, not for what made her different, but for everything that made her whole. And every evening, without fail, when the wolves of Aldergate raised their voices to greet the coming night, Illyra listened, and smiled, and knew without question that the sound she heard was not warning, nor curse, but welcome. It always had been, from that very first night, though it had taken her heart considerably longer to believe it.